carbon footprint. Part 4. ISO 14067. Before we proceed to Part 4, let's recap what we had learned in Part 3. There are 6 parts that we learn in Part 3, which are general requirement, goal and scope, inventory analysis, impact assessment, interpretation and limitation. First, a general requirement that needed to be applied in the entire work. CFP include 4 phases of LCA, LCI, LCIA, and life cycle interpretation. Goal is what that need to be carried out, that need to be accomplished, while scope is the guideline in making the decisions of an project. Third, inventory analysis is compilation and quantification of inputs and outputs for a product throughout its life cycle. Next, impact assessment is a process for predicting and evaluating the environmental, health, social and economic impact of product along the process. While interpretation part, we have learned on identification of the significant issues based on the results of the quantification of the CFP according to LCI and LCIA phases. And last, limitations part, we have identified and learned about 2 important inherent of limitations, which are, first, focus on a single environmental issue, and second, limitation related to the methodology. Part 4. The first part is reporting. There are 3 purposes of CFP study report. The first one is to document the results of the quantification of the CFP study. The second is to present the decisions within the goal and scope definition phase. The last one, which is the third one, is to demonstrate that the provisions of the international standard have been met. Right now, we're going to discuss about additional requirements and guidances for carbon footprint. These are some of the additional requirements. The assessment shall be carried out for different points in time in conformity with international standard. This is to prevent variation in results obtained. Then, the change shall be calculated for products with an identical functional unit. Next, if there are 2 separate assessment, we need to use same method for both assessment. Some of the method might involve equivalent systems for selecting or managing data, system boundaries, allocation, identical characterization factors and others. Now, let's look at the summary of specific greenhouse gases values of the carbon footprint and corresponding documentation requirements. The first one is the specific sources and sinks of the carbon footprint, and the next is specific information documented separately in the carbon footprint report. The components that shall be included is greenhouse gases emissions and removals arising from fossils and biogenic carbon sources and sinks. Other than that is, greenhouse gases emissions and removals occurring as a result of direct land use change. Next, non-CO2 greenhouse gases emissions and removals arising from livestock, manure, or soils. And also aircraft greenhouse gases emissions. Right now, we are going to see what should be included and what should be considered in specific sources and sinks of the carbon footprint. What should be included is soil carbon change only if it is not calculated as part of land use change. Then, what should be considered is greenhouse gases emissions and removals occurring as a result of indirect land use change. For specific information documented separately in the carbon footprint study report, we will look at what shall be documented and what shall be documented if it is calculated. What shall be documented are greenhouse gases emissions and removals arising from fossil sources and sinks, greenhouse gases emissions and removals arising from biogenic carbon sources and sinks, greenhouse gases emissions and removals occurring as a result of direct land use change, and also aircraft greenhouse gases emissions. Furthermore, matters that shall be documented if calculated are soil carbon change, greenhouse gases emissions and removals occurring as a result of indirect land use change, and also effect of carbon storage arising from the use stage and/or end-of-life stage of the products. Next, we will continue with critical review. Critical review is the process to ensure the consistency between life cycle assessment and the principle and requirement of the international standard of the life cycle, which is ISO 14040 and ISO 14044. For your information, critical review is to get the verification. Critical review shall ensure, first, the method used to carry out the LCA are consistent with this international standard. Second, the method used to carry out the LCA are scientifically and technically valid. Third, the data used are appropriate and reasonable in relation to the goal of the study. Fourth, the interpretations reflect the limitation identified and the goal of the study. Fifth, the study report is transparent and consistent. In critical review, we have two types of critical review, which is Type 1, where they're critical review by internal and external expert. Type 2, critical review by interested parties or independent third parties. Critical review Type 1 is suited for internal study only and not approved for the comparative assertion to be made available to public. However, if want, a critical review Type 2 has to be accomplished. Next, we will discuss about the criteria if we want to make CFP communication as publicly available. Publicly available is referring a CFP report deliberately placed in public domain or intended to be available to consumer. CFP communication to make publicly available should be, first is be verified by an independent third party. Second, be reported completely and accurately without bias. Next, we will discuss in detail about third-party CFP verification. If the CFP communication is verified by an independent third party, a verification statement shall be made available to the intended party. The third-party verifications is required to make the CFP report available to the public. There are a few of minimum requirement that verification team shall be meet, such as: 1 must have knowledge of relevant sector, product, and product-related environment aspect. 2 is process and product knowledge of the product category. 3 expertise in LCA and methodology of LCA work. 4 knowledge of relevant standard in the fields of environment labeling and declarations, LCA, and CFP. 5 knowledge of the regulatory framework within which requirement for CFP communication have been prepared. 6 knowledge of the CFP communication program, when applicable. Lastly, must have knowledge of the verification or validation of environment data. For the scope of CFP verification shall as a minimum confirm the following: 1 the LCA, LCI, and information modules. 2 appropriate selection of CFP-PCR. 3 conformance with the CFP-PCR. 4 conformance with this international standard. 5 the quality and accuracy of the CFP-based data and calculations. 6 the quality and accuracy of any supporting information. Lastly, for scope of CFP verification, it shall have data evaluation that includes coverage, precision, completeness, representativeness, consistency, reproducibility, sources, and uncertainty. However, if an organization does not perform an independent third-party verification but they still want to make it available to public, they need to support the CFP communication with CFP disclosure report. In general, information and scope shall include: 1 is contact information. 2 contact studied product name and description. 3 the functional unit of product system and reference flow. 4 type of CFP, either partial or full. 5 CFP-PCR, if used. 6 life cycle inventory date and version. 7 a disclaimer stating the relevant limitation of various potential uses. For boundary setting in CFP disclosure report, the following shall be included, such as: 1 a process map including process in the life cycle inventory. 2 exclusion and justification for their exclusion. 3 time period for assessment of GHG emission and removals. 4 allocation, disclosure and justification of the method used to avoid or perform allocation due to co-product or recycling shall be documented. Next, for data collection and quality in CFP disclosure report, the following shall be included: 1 the method used to calculate LUC when applicable. 2 a description such as data sources, data quality, and effort taken to for improvement data quality. 3 methodological choices include such as: 1 allocation methods. 2 calculation models. Last part is CFP results. The following shall be included in CFP results in CFP disclosure report: 1 source and date of GWP factor used. 2 total life cycle inventory result in units of CO2e per functional unit of product system includes such as all GHG emission and removal included in the boundary from biogenic sources and non-biogenic sources including LUC. 3 percentage of total life cycle inventory results by life cycle stage. 4 biogenic and non-biogenic GHG emissions and removals separately. 5 an assessment in order to understand the uncertainty of the result. And lastly, must have results of previous review if have. Moving on to the components of CFP study report. There are 13 components of required information in CFP study report. All the information are following the guidance provided in ISO 14044:2006. The information include selected methods and GHG values, data, results, assumptions, life cycle interpretations, conclusions, sensitivity check of the significant inputs, assessment of the influence of alternative use profiles, end-of-life scenarios on the final result, cutoffs, timing of delayed GHG emissions, description of data, which include decisions concerning data, details of individual data, and assessment of data quality. Lastly, relevant assumptions for the end-life stage. Next, for the optional information in CFP study report, there are 10 types of information. The information include scope, modified scope with justification and exclusion, description of the stages of the life cycle, description of the selected use profiles, and end-of-life scenarios, system boundary, description of significant unit processes, results of the life cycle interpretation including conclusions and limitations. Disclosure of value choices that have been made in the context of decisions within the CFP study, time period for which the CFP is representative, treatment of electricity, relevant assumptions for the use stage, and lastly, graphical presentation of results of the CFP study. Moving on to the Q&A, for Part 4. To demonstrate that the provisions of the international standard have been met is one of the purpose of CFP study report. True or false? The answer is true. If two separate assessments are made, the change shall be calculated using the different method for each assessments. Do you think the statement is true or false? The answer is the statement is wrong. The true answer is, if two separate assessments are made, the change shall be calculated using the same method for both assessments. Last quiz is if an organization wants to make the CFP report publicly available, what type of critical review they need to be done. It is type 1, which is critical review by internal and external expert. Or type 2, interested or independent third party. The answer is B, which must be verified by interested and independent third party if they want the CFP report to make to the public. Which of the following is the optional information in CFP study report? A. Life cycle interpretations. B. Cutoffs. C. System boundary. D. Assumption. The answer is C. System boundary. Moving on to the summary from Part 4. For reporting, there are 3 purposes of CFP study report. The first one is to document the results of the quantification of the CFP study. Second, to present the decisions within the goal and scope definition phase. And third, to demonstrate that the provisions of the international standard have been met. As for additional requirements and guidances, there are 2 important things that we need to know. The first one is the assessments shall be done accordingly based on the international standards. Next, it is required to include and document GHG emissions and certain soil carbon change in the report. For critical review, we must know there are 2 types of critical review, which is type 1 and type 2. If an organization want to make their report publicly available, they need to accomplish critical review type 2. For the contents of CFP study report, all the information are following the guidance in ISO 14044:2006. For required information, there are 13 components must be included in CFP study report. While for optional information, there are 10 components that are optional to be included in CFP study report. That is all. Thank you for watching.